This is Democracy,
a podcast that explores the interracial, intergenerational, and intersectional
unheard voices living in the world's
most influential democracy.
Welcome to our new episode of This is Democracy. This week marks the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. The 36th state to ratify the amendment at the time was Tennessee on August 18th, 1920. And we are marking that 100th anniversary, not just of the amendment, but of a movement, one of the most important and ongoing social movements in American history, the women's movement, broadly defined. And we have with us today one of the foremost experts, professors, teachers, and just one of the most wonderful people who actually writes about and talks about all of these issues, Professor Lisa Tetrault. She's an associate professor of history at Carnegie Mellon University. She was a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I had the good fortune to get to know her a little bit. She specializes in the history of gender, race, and American democracy, with an emphasis on memory and social movements. She's the author of a fantastic prize-winning book, The Myth of Seneca Falls, Memory and the Women's Suffrage Movement, 1848 to 1898. We will talk about the myth of Seneca Falls today. And Lisa, I'm sure many of you have seen her and heard her. She's a frequent commentator on suffrage and a variety of issues related to that. She's a historical consultant for the 19th Amendment projects launched by the National Constitution Center, the Woodrow Wilson House, and the Schlesinger Library. And she's been involved with Ancestry.com, PBS, Public Broadcasting, and the American Experience, the Smithsonian Institution, and various other organizations. We're fortunate that Lisa was able to take time out of her busy schedule this week of big anniversaries to talk to us. Thank you, Lisa, for joining us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be with you. I'm a big admirer of the podcast.
Well, we're lucky to have you on. And before we turn to our discussion with Lisa, we have, of course, Zachary's scene-setting poem. Zachary, what is the title of your poem?
The Pained Footsteps.
Let's hear it.
Old streets are like old houses. There are so many of them in this country, yet I know that so many are counting their victories now. So many of them remembering the movements of today and the women of yesterday. I'd like to think that the streets are sisters in arms, that they too relish the giant white banners pulled by horses over their paving stones, the women converging on musty convention halls over their soon-to-be worn paths, and the picketing freedom fighters who chanted, demanded, and tasted victory on the cobblestones and asphalt layers of old streets. I'd like to think that Pennsylvania Avenue still remembers Alice Paul. I'd like to think that Fifth Avenue still smiles at the memory of Shirley Chisholm. I'd like to think that Congress Avenue still remembers my footprints that day when I marched with my sister and mother to the state capitol. I'd like to think that deep down the old bones of the continent are cheering, screaming for justice as they suffer the pained footsteps of those still without suffrage. I'd like to think that Houston still remembers Gloria Steinem. I'd like to think that Wilmington is just beginning to enshrine Kamala Harris within its gray cells. That the chair I sat in Poughkeepsie as we watched the convention 4 years ago still remembers Hillary Clinton. And I'd like to think that City Hall can still see my sister's smile the day my mother was sworn in. I'd like to think that both of us will never forget standing in the voting booth with my father as the button was pressed over our mother's name.
Well, Zachary, I'm glad you attest to the fact that I voted for Mom when she ran for office. That's very important. What is your poem about, Zachary?
Well, my poem is really about the enduring importance of the women's movement and how it's been intergenerational and how important it is that we can continue to struggle for women's rights today.
Well, that's such a great place for us to start. Lisa, where do you start this story when you teach this subject or when you talk about this subject?
It depends on which story you're talking about. The thing that I've been emphasizing over the centennial is that it's so many different stories. And that we've had, and part of what the Myth of Seneca Falls is about is trying to narrow this to one story, the 1848 to 1920 story. And it is so many other stories. And so I've been trying to emphasize that we have to just take in the full complexity of the story. And I do that when I teach as well. So where I begin often varies, and where we end often varies as well, based on the interests and the whims of the particular political climate of the moment we're in. But so I think one of the best places to start is with the amendment itself, at least for the centennial story. There are lots of stories here, but the centennial story, I think we spend far too little time actually looking at the amendment. And what has been most surprising to me and to the audiences I've been speaking with has been that women did not win the right to vote. What happened was that the amendment said you may not discriminate in voting on the basis of sex. So a lot of people think what the amendment did was allow women into the right to vote existing in the Constitution. There is no right to vote in the Constitution, and that stuns people. So the 19th Amendment didn't let women into the right to vote in the Constitution. It was only the second time in U.S. history that citizens had ever used the Constitution to regulate the states, who are actually the ones who create and appoint voters. And what it said to the states is you cannot use the word male in your voter qualification clauses. And so what it did was strike down an obstacle. And for some women, that was the one obstacle remaining. For other women, that obstacle had been struck down prior, in many cases decades prior, by their own individual state who'd already voluntarily relinquished that word. And then finally, it was necessary for all women to get that word struck, but it wasn't sufficient. For many women, plenty of other state obstacles still stood in their way, so they couldn't vote. So in many ways, that shifts our sense of this both as a beginning and an end. It is neither a beginning to women's voting, nor is it an end of women's pursuit of voting.
That's such a helpful way to think about this, and you've captured that complexity in actually a very accessible way. I guess we should start with this question about the right to vote. Many people presume that the Constitution includes a right to vote.
That's true.
We'd have to begin with the absence of that, correct?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And I think we have to begin with the absence of that because everyone's so convinced they know what happened. And so then it's just a matter of fleshing out what happened, when in fact, our very conception of what happened is in fact flawed.
And so before 1920, how did determinations of who would have a right to vote, how were those determinations made? And what can we say about that for that period?
They were made the same way they were made after 1920, which is that the states had the right to determine who gets to vote and who doesn't. In other words, they draw up long lists of criteria you have to meet. In 1870, a group of citizens pressing on the U.S. Congress and the Congress itself decided to use the Constitution for the very first time to regulate the states and say, you may not do this practice in your voter disenfranchisement, or what we could call your voter eligibility, which was really voter disenfranchisement. And it said you may not use the word race. That was the 15th Amendment, and that was in the aftermath of emancipation. This amendment that so-called gave Black men the right to vote. Really what it did is say states may not use the word white in their constitutions for determining voters. And that was the first time that had happened. And then the states continued to be in charge of these things, and many states voluntarily dropped the word male as we move across. By the time the 19th Amendment passes Congress, the entire West is voting. Women are voting on the same terms as men, and even in some eastern states. New York dropped the word male in 1917. That did not mean all women voted, though, because a lot of those women were then subject to new voter qualification clauses that the states had thrown up starting in the 1890s, which were meant to disenfranchise those Black men and other men of color, literacy tests, poll taxes, things that didn't explicitly mention race, and thereby adhered to the spirit of the 15th Amendment, but grossly violated its, or at least adhered, I should say, to the letter of the amendment, but grossly violated its spirit. So we are still in that same thing today. We have two more constitutional amendments after the 19th that regulate the states in terms of what they can and can't do in terms of eliminating voters. They cannot use poll taxes, an amendment that gets added to the Constitution in the 1960s. And then finally, of course, the one lowering the voting age to 18. And then there's a few other federal laws that say to the states, you may not discriminate on these bases. But those came about largely with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And what happened with the Voting Rights Act is not to just say you can't use literacy tests. I know you have to stop racist, registration patterns and things like that. It also said we, the federal government, are going to come back really for the first time since Reconstruction 100 years earlier and regulate your practices and make sure you aren't actually adhering to giving people access to voting to states that were discriminatory. And then the Supreme Court gutted that in 2013 and took that away in a Shelby County v. Holder decision, saying that discrimination was in fact a thing of the past. Therefore, this law was no longer needed. And, I wish I lived in the fantasy world of that majority decision. But what we've seen is that the states have now thrown up all kinds of new obstacles, closing early voting, shutting down polling places, creating voter ID laws, gerrymandering, the disenfranchisement of formerly incarcerated people for life, all of these types of things. So what we've seen again is that the states are now busily throwing up new disenfranchisement practices, just skirting all of the things that past social movements have managed to render invalid.
We have this myth of the women's movement starting and in many ways also ending with Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton in stuffy rooms in the late 19th century. How does that line up with reality, and why has that narrative become the sort of prevalent story of the women's movement?
Yes. So let's see if I can distill this into a short version. One is Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton weren't together. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was the one at Seneca Falls. Susan B. Anthony was not. But when Susan B. Anthony died, her obituaries would say she began the movement at Seneca Falls in 1848. That story doesn't exist. There is a women's rights convention in 1848 in Seneca Falls. It's sort of the debut of Stanton's activism. She won't meet Anthony until 3 years later in 1851, at which point they will become the closest of friends and allies and comrades in arms, and will become one of the most famous feminist friendships of the 19th century. They'll die in the early 1900s before the amendment passes. And after the American Civil War, they will devote basically their entire lives. Anthony is now kind of free of child rearing, or Stanton is now free of child rearing. They're somewhat conflated to me, those two. And then Anthony never has children, and they'll dedicate really all of the decades of their post-Civil War lives to activism. And social movements are messy. We like to remember social movements and kind of particularly women politicians as sainted and venerated and lovely and harmonious and, all kumbaya. It was not like that. There were a lot of people who didn't like Stanton and Anthony. There were a lot of people who thought they were a real liability to the cause, Lucy Stone being primary among them. And Stanton and Anthony got in lots of hot water after the American Civil War. They did a lot of really horrible things. They jeopardized the movement in some people's eyes. And so they were in trouble. Their leadership, which was still fledgling, was embattled. And one of the things they end up doing for complicated reasons that I spell out in the book is they start using history to justify their position in the present. And I think this is not unique to them. It's something I think we all do. History really is about how we make sense of ourselves in the present. And they start telling a story of Seneca Falls. And at this point, nobody's ever heard of this thing, right? They're like, Seneca Falls, what are you talking about? And they have to kind of teach people this story. And part of the reason they teach it is to say, we began the movement. Therefore, we are the movement. Therefore, all the choices we're making in the present in this very fraught Civil War era are in fact the right choices, and you should follow us. And they do a bunch of other things. But really, the story of Seneca Falls is very different than the event of Seneca Falls. And what I try to do is write a history of the story and how the story itself became a political actor. And I think we need to ask ourselves today, what kind of moral lessons are we imparting and what kind of politics are we participating in every time we retell that story? Because it's not a neutral story.
No, that's, very well said. And it's a point that's been made, I think, by you and others in recent weeks very well. It's a story that seems to be largely a white women's story in the way it's traditionally told.
And that's part of the problem with it. Yes, it's traditionally a white women's story. It elevates the vote as the kind of most important of all reforms when many women were arguing for a very differently situated women's rights agenda. And it doesn't at all capture the history of women of color who wouldn't identify with this meeting necessarily. So there's all kinds of things that it does that I think are deeply problematic.
So one of the things that often gets missed as well, it seems to me, is who were the key opponents? Who was standing in the way? Because it does seem, in retrospect, that everyone wants to embrace what you've described as a kind of mythical movement, and everyone wants to be a mythical supporter of it. How do we understand the opposition?
The opposition is not unlike the opposition that we often hear today to sort of, say, gay marriage or interracial marriage, and that is that it will topple the family and thereby topple civilization. And the idea goes here, at least in this case, that men and women are biologically different creatures, right? They are two branches of the human race, and they are meant, therefore, to inhabit this world differently. Women are meant to inhabit it, their particular biological role is to kind of be home, be nurturing, be passive, be supportive. And men's is to be, to exercise their brain and their ambition and their rough and tumble, constitution out in the public world. And the idea was, if you enfranchised women, the opponents would say, and many of these opponents were women, you upset the gender relation of the world, thereby upsetting the family. And there were all these cartoons of men stuck with babies and wearing skirts, and kind of women out in the public being domineering and looking very masculine. And thereby, if you upset gender norms, you upset the family, and thereby, civilization itself will come crashing down. So, and we hear this argument again and again and again and again. If you do this, it defies God's wishes, and God meant for the family to be this way, and we can't defile the family, because if we do, civilization will come crashing down. And part of what happens is that over the time that this press for the Federal Amendment unfolds, women start voting in more and more and more and more states. And lo and behold, the world does not fall off its axis. It continues to go around, and the family seems all right, and the nation seems all right, with, huge problems. But so eventually voting women themselves give lie to this idea. But we hear the same thing, around the Equal Rights Amendment, right? This was Phyllis Schlafly's argument as well.
Absolutely. Why then in 1919? You've painted a very compelling picture of many strands coming together, many different pushes and pull factors. Certainly 1919 was not a time when you had a favorable federal government in Woodrow Wilson. So why did it happen at this time?
I think the reasons are so many that the ones I'll spew out probably won't even begin to sufficiently answer the question. But World War I, which is ongoing in this, at the last chapters of this, is huge. And the women's movement is yet split again after Stanton and Anthony die, and Lucy Stone dies. And it's split between Carrie Chapman Catt and Alice Paul. Carrie Chapman Catt's idea is with the National American Woman Suffrage Association, which people pronounce as NAWSA. That Nassau should, curry the favor of politicians, win over their affections, win over their support, and support the war. Alice Paul's is, let's take it to them. I don't care about whether or not they like me. I want to make them uncomfortable until they concede my point. She's the more militant, kind of out in the streets, rabble-rousing. Carrie Chapman Catt's convinced that this is going to jeopardize the cause. So when the war breaks out, Carrie Chapman Catt gets the huge Nassau organization to throw its support into the war. And Woodrow Wilson will say in letters and in his speeches, women's war support means that they are full citizens who are defending this nation and therefore, are deserved of its most sacred right, which, as we've said, is a fiction. And then Alice Paul and other people will use World War I as a way to embarrass the nation on an international stage. Civil rights activists will do the same. Here we are, defending the world, defending democracy, in World War I, and we're not even granting it here at home. So they'll start reading Woodrow Wilson's speeches defending democracy and point out the hypocrisy of them when it comes to American women and throw them into trash barrels in front of the White House. And they'll even unfurl a banner calling him Kaiser Wilson. So there's a way in which both sides of the movement leverage the war to win over Woodrow Wilson's support. And so Woodrow Wilson will come out and support women's suffrage. And then there are a variety of other things going on, including that women are voting already in pretty massive numbers. So in many ways, the 19th Amendment is only confirming what's already happened in large part. There are only 8 states when the 19th Amendment is ratified where women are not voting in some fashion. In many of those other states, women had partial suffrage, where they were allowed to vote in certain types of elections, but not on the same terms as men. So that's going on. And I think there's another really key piece that we don't talk about sufficiently, and that is that it has also become palatable, I think, to pass the 19th Amendment because so many states have put in racialized restrictions over the 1890s and the 1910s. And so that many white politicians know that if they take the word male out, they will only be largely enfranchising, although not exclusively, white women. And I think we don't talk enough about the ways in which the simultaneous history of disenfranchisement going on at this same time leads to, I think, the ratification of the 19th Amendment. So we can't isolate gender as a variable in many ways. And there are lots of other reasons why it goes through, but those would be my top four.
No, and that really captures, I think, some of the central dynamics that you and others have written about. This tension between gender and race, is that something that continues after 1919?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it continues straight up until today, as Zachary's poem so eloquently illustrated. So, yes, it absolutely continues. It's rife throughout the movement. And one of the things that people like Martha Jones and others who are coming out with terrific books right around now are saying is, we have made a mistake to only look for women of color's activism inside white suffrage organizations. Where are the women of color? That is hugely important to locate them and see what their voices and their agendas are. But there's been a lot of work now to also trace women of color's organizing on their own terms, which shows up in places where, white suffragists are not organizing. So that activism is going on, and those organizations and those women in the wake of 1920 will come to the flagship suffrage organization saying, many of us, not all of us, but many of us still can't vote because of these other restrictions. And those white suffrage organizations, the leadership of both NASA and the National Women's Party will say, we don't care. I mean, literally, they will say, we don't care. Our fight is over. We've won our fight. And your problems are your problems. That's a race issue, as if women only live with race issues and not with gender issues as well. We've finished the gender fight, which goes to show the degree to which they're envisioning gender white here. And so they will abandon the suffrage movement and let these women sort of go off and, fight in league with Black men and in league with other men of color who are having their votes stolen as well. And they will continue to push and be really important in the enactment of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which is in some ways the culmination of the story of women of color.
It's striking to me because what you just described also resonates with the ways in which we've rewritten in the last 10 to 20 years the history of the civil rights movement, right? Which
Yes.
is now, in many ways built around the work of African-American women and other women of color in various communities. To what extent are the women who are not included in the traditional women's rights organizations, to what extent are they instrumental in what we come to call the civil rights movement?
Deeply, always. Yes. And I think, plenty of scholars have underlined this point again and again and again and again, that women are consistently present in civil rights organizing, not only just consistently present, but essential and overlooked.
And so do you see the 19th Amendment then as a civil rights amendment, or how do you frame it? It's obviously not an amendment that creates a right to vote that still doesn't exist. Would you put it in the context of a broader civil rights struggle? How would you frame it in that sense?
I would frame it as the kind of narrow ways in which white women's organizing has often just organized around whiteness. So to me, it's very much the kind of narrowness of feminism that forgets to think that the issues of white women are not the issues of all women. Because really it just goes after the word male, right? Only white women can really isolate that variable. Yeah. It goes after the word male. And then when other women come to them and say, we are still not voting, they say, our fight is done. So to me, the fight for the vote is, interesting and laudable and essential and helps all women in many ways because all women need the word male removed. But I would say that the activists themselves, I wouldn't put this as part of a civil rights story. If anything, I think it's hostile to a civil rights story.
And so I think that's a great spot for us to talk about the present then, if you're willing. So what are the lessons then at this anniversary moment, which for whatever reasons draws our attention often inaccurately to these milestones in our history, what are the lessons you think we should take away, especially, in a moment when many people feel that our rights are under attack?
They are under attack. They don't feel that it is factual that they are under attack. We are in the midst of one of the largest campaigns of voter suppression or voter disenfranchisement since before the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And I think what we have to remember is the right to vote has still not been won, which is partly what's making this voter disenfranchisement campaign in the states possible. And also that the 19th Amendment left state governance over voting in place. And so states can dream up all kinds of new ways to disenfranchise, and that's exactly what they're doing right now. And for me, the anniversary has been a chance for us to both dispel the myth that Americans have the right to vote, which I think lulls us into a sense of complacency and also a sense of kind of myopia around the disenfranchisement that's taking place right now. And secondly, to give us a chance to realize that fight is ongoing, that it's not finished. I think the 1920 story wants us very much to put this in the past when it is alive and well in the present. And so also gauge the health of our current democracy and ask ourselves as citizens, we've been handed a past. What do we intend to do with it now?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And a question I get a lot, and I'm sure you get as well, is for those who believe everything you said, and I think it's what you're saying is incredibly powerful and in many ways obvious. It's in plain sight. What is it that social movements today, what is it that our students and those who are listening to us who care about Black Lives Matter and care about voting rights and are out there and are protesting in front of the Postmaster General's home, what are the lessons they should take away, positive and negative, in the formation of their movement today?
That voting alone has never been sufficient, that we absolutely must have social movements and voting together. And in fact, it is social movements that have expanded and turned this country into a democracy, which is something the founders never intended. Social protest has created this country into a democracy, and social protest is the only thing that will preserve it as a democracy.
On that note, we've seen a dramatic increase in recent decades in women voting, but how come that hasn't translated in the same way to equal representation in political office? We still see, particularly in Congress and certainly in the presidency and vice presidency, a total lack of representation of women.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, sexism and racism are alive and well. And so I think the idea that a woman is capable of governance, I think, is still something that many Americans are deeply skeptical about.
And do you see the selection of Kamala Harris as a vice presidential candidate? Do you see that as a milestone? And how can we use that, whether one likes her or not? How can one use that to advance a more inclusive vision of participation in our democracy?
Oh, it is unquestionably a milestone. I mean, it's incredible. And it is something to celebrate in all kinds of ways, regardless of how you might feel about her. But I might also point out that we hold female politicians to a standard that we do not hold white male kind of aging politicians to. They must be perfect. They must be, they must be all these things that we don't demand of our white male politicians. And so I am deeply skeptical of a interrogation of her that is not equally visited upon an interrogation of aging white male politicians. So I'm not saying we shouldn't interrogate, and I'm also saying I'm not sure why a woman has to be the perfect candidate, particularly a woman of color. I was listening to Brittany Cooper the other day, who was very rightly saying, like, you don't get into mainstream politics and make your way up to the vice presidency if you are not somehow playing the game, right? You don't come in with purity, right? You would never get to that spot if you did. And let's get some access and representation at the table, and then let's see what we can do with it. So I tend to take a more pragmatic view and say, she is certainly a more progressive candidate than many of the white men who've run for office. So
Right. Well, and your point hits home to me because Allison, my wife, as you know, is on the city council here in Austin, elected office,
mhm.
and I just notice, and I should have seen this before, but I didn't. But I notice now, watching her on a day-to-day basis, how she's held to a different standard, and it's a much more critical standard, and it comes from men and women, and
Yep,
it's
absolutely.
it's
Yep,
striking from everything from just interpersonal interactions to policy debates to every single issue.
absolutely. Yep. And there are studies done of like who gets interrupted most on the U.S. Supreme Court, and it's the women justices, and they're interrupted mostly by the other male justices, right? So even that it is alive and well, the sense that women are held to a different standard and that they shouldn't speak as much and they shouldn't take up as much space and they shouldn't, so.
So the question I wanted to close on, Lisa, and I've been thinking about this since we planned out this podcast episode. What are the sources of hope today? I find that when I talk to students and other young people, they really want to be hopeful. They're not as knowledgeable as they will be after they listen to you and read your work, but they share a hope for a more inclusive future. And I think there's a lot of goodwill out there. What are the sources of hope today, and are you hopeful?
I am hopeful. I've conceded defeat if I give up hope, and I refuse to do that. And what's hopeful to me is both the past, that people have overcome and changed really dire situations in our country through this process of combination of voting and social protest. And also young people. I have to say, being a teacher in a college classroom has saved my sanity. They are young people I find to be just incredibly just inspiring. And just recently, my 10-year-old daughter, we were in a city park and there were signs up on the bathroom that said you had to use your gender assigned at birth. And my 10-year-old daughter was enraged by this, and she went and got paper and tape and covered it all up. And, just to think that young people insist on a world that has the kind of diversity and the kind of variety that we embrace and that we affirm, which I think so much of the campaign of voter suppression is about denying and erasing. I just feel like the numbers are against them and they can't win. So,
which is why they try to suppress the vote, right? You don't do
That's
that
right.
unless you think you don't have the numbers.
Right, exactly. And, all evidence would suggest that higher turnout and, more demographic diversity, leads to, more voter turnout for Democrats. And so, Barack Obama had one of the, most robust get out the vote campaigns, in U.S. history in the 20th century. And it really diversified the electorate and brought in so many folks who were not voting prior, who come from different demographics. And that scared the hell out of the Republicans. And they are trying to shut that down, which is why we have this campaign of voter suppression right now.
Right. And I think one of the most useful ways to turn this anniversary into a moment of progress is just what you said, to have these conversations and to remember that there is hope, because so much has been overcome in the past and it can be overcome today also.
Yep, absolutely.
Zachary, does this inspire young people? Do you think that we can see the 19th Amendment as inspiration for an opening toward a more inclusive society today? Does that move young people like you?
Well, I can't speak to the experience of young women and girls my age, but I definitely think that what this re-examining of the history of the 19th Amendment and the women's movement shows us is that change takes a really long time, but that we can actually make enormous progress if we keep working and we keep fighting for different causes, but also that change is messy and that it really does take a long time. So I think we need to be wary of people who offer quick solutions, but at the same time, keep up the fight and keep trying to achieve the sort of maybe unattainable dream, but of equality for everyone and suffrage for everyone.
Very well said, Zachary. That the celebration is in many ways a call to arms, isn't it? Lisa, thank you so much for taking the time, especially when you're in such demand right now. Thank you for taking the time to share your wisdom on the past and the present and future. It's great having you on.
It's been wonderful to be with you both.
And Zachary, thank you for your poem. And most of all, thank you to our listeners for joining us for this episode of This is Democracy.
This podcast is produced by the Liberal Arts Development Studio and the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin.
The music in this episode was written and recorded by Harrison Lemke, and you can find his music at harrisonlemke.com.
Subscribe and stay tuned for a new episode every Thursday featuring new perspectives on democracy.